Welcome to Unbroken the podcast. I'm Savannah Levins. I started this podcast because in my life experience and working as a news reporter, I found everyone's been knocked down or blindsided or had their world seemingly turned upside down at some point. And for many people, it's cathartic to talk about their experiences out loud. And likewise, it can be therapeutic to hear other people's stories and know that there is light at the end of all darkness. If you have a story you'd like to share on the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. Just email unbrokenthepodcast@gmail.com. And please rate, review, and subscribe. On today's episode, we have Liz, who had a really rough childhood. It led to her rebelling in her teens with drugs and crime. She was in and out of jail and ended up dropping out of high school. When she hit rock bottom, she had a revelation. Here's Liz. Today on the podcast, we have Liz. Liz, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
We were just chatting a little bit of background before we started recording, and I am already blown away by your story. You have had such a tough go of it and have made so much out of yourself now. It's really an incredible story. I'm excited for people to hear. And a lot of it begins with your childhood because you had a rough time coming up. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you so much. So I had a lot of childhood trauma, and in a nutshell, it contains, poverty for one. So we grew up with nothing on welfare, food stamps, and then a single mother home. My mother was a single mother of 4 children. My father left when I was 5 years old, and I never saw him again. And I knew, and I still vividly remember the moment when he left, and I was holding onto his leg, begging him not to go, and knowing in my little 5-year-old mind that I would never see him again. So that was a huge wound. And then my mother later remarried to my stepfather, who was an alcoholic, who was abusive, who was sexually abusive. So that was another huge wound. And then the results of all of that just kind of culminated in my teenage years. And I was a very angry, shy, insecure, withdrawn child. Had a lot of issues as a teenager, obviously so, and had, looking back now, undiagnosed PTSD, depression, anxiety, social anxiety, panic attacks. First panic attack started at age 15 when I was in 10th grade.
How long was your mother married to this man who was abusing you?
They were married for, I believe it was a total of about 7 years.
So until you were about how old, or what?
Till about 12. Okay. He was in and out though, so they were off and on during that time. So she would leave him, and then they would go back together.
But you described those years of your life, which are very formative years, as just feeling very afraid, obviously.
Very, yes. I know now, looking back, that I was basically in fight or flight state for years of those formative years, and that fearful survival mode all of the time, trying to run away from him or be away from him or not ever be around him alone, and trying to maneuver and just never be alone with him, living in fear for years of my life.
And you also talked about being afraid to approach your mother about this because you're young.
Yes. Oh, yes. And gosh, the statistics are that most kids never tell. And usually, I think it's an average, don't quote me for sure on this, but average of 15 years before people ever tell, so they're well into their adulthood if they ever tell. Kids are afraid, they're shameful, they take on the shame of the abuser oftentimes, and so I was completely full of shame and thought I had done something wrong, and I didn't tell my mom until I was probably 18 or 19. I mentioned it and kind of talked about it just briefly with her. I think she kind of saw signs and knew things were wrong because I remember her asking me, has he ever done anything? Is he doing anything? And I remember crying, saying, if I tell you, will you leave him? If I tell you, will you leave him? And then she was confused and thought that maybe I just didn't want him around. And so would she say this because she wants me to leave him, and parents get really confused and they don't know what to believe often, and I never really even said. It's a very scary thing for a kid and an adult to have to face something like that.
Right, yeah. And then that kind of culminated in some behavioral problems for you, obviously, as you became a teen. Talk about that.
Yes, so I told you earlier, so I lost my voice completely after this sexual abuse. I could not speak almost. It was, kids are affected in different ways, lots of different ways from this, and that's one of the things that sometimes happens. So I completely lost my voice. I couldn't talk. I remember going to school and not speaking for hours out of the day, and I had been very outgoing and talkative and would sing in class prior to that, so it completely shut me down. Kids would think I was mute, that I couldn't talk, became severely withdrawn and shy, had severe social and emotional issues in school, couldn't form friendships, had difficulty with that. And school became such a difficult thing for me. And I had always done really well in school and had loved school and loved learning. But this social and emotional aspect was just such a huge part of it. And I couldn't move past it.
Right. Are we talking high school at this point?
So all throughout school. And then in high school, it really got bad. I started hanging out with the wrong crowd. Mm-hmm. I started running away from home. I started getting involved with drugs and alcohol and older kids, older boys. Just really got in trouble a lot. Started going to jail for multiple times. My mom would have to pick me up from the jail station, police station. I would run away for 2 weeks at a time. She wouldn't know where I was, where I'd been. I ended up dropping out of high school because it was so difficult, and I was on probation, and then they told me I had to go to school and I wouldn't go, so then I got sent to a juvenile detention training school boot camp when I was 17, and it was for like 12 weeks. And at the time, I thought that was probably the worst thing that could ever happen to me, is to be ripped up and away from my family and from home into this place 6 hours away, out into this barren area where there's like kids doing boot camp, getting up at 4 a.m. marching and platoons and things like that. But it was honestly one of the best things that ever happened to me, and it was a big turning point for me.
And to go back a little bit, when you're going through all these things, there's so many red flags you're sending up, middle school, not talking, into high school, getting arrested, and older boys and drugs. Your mother, where was she during this time? Was she?
So I know, and it's hard to understand. And
I know she was a single mom again.
She had 4 kids, and she was working too. And she, honestly, she was doing the best that she could, and she didn't have the resources either, or the knowledge, or the things that she needed. And she was dealing with her own stuff and her own things and her own traumas that she had never resolved, and that I believe get passed down from generation to generation until someone decides to break the cycle and change it. So she was already wrapped up in all of her own stuff and her own depression and her own issues, and so much that she couldn't even see or know what to do for me. She just knew there was something wrong, but she didn't know what to do, and we had no insurance, and we had no, she didn't know to, I guess, take me to a therapist or take me to somewhere to get help, and she did everything she could, and I probably wouldn't have gone at that point anyway, and
Yeah. Do you remember any particular points when you were in school that feel very visceral to you still now, or stand out as very low points?
Oh, very much so. Well, my first panic attack was at age 15 when I was in 10th grade, and I had to stand up and do an oral reading of a poem, of a play, and I just remember standing there having like a severe panic attack in the middle of this, and I couldn't breathe. My heart was beating out of my chest. I was flushed from head to toe. I thought I was going to faint and pass out. And I thought, oh my God, this was horrible. I will never speak in front of people ever again. And that began I had already had a fear of public speaking, as a lot of people do, but then it became like, okay, I'll never do this again. And it solidified even more, like my loss of voice and my loss of being able to speak up and speak out. So that's really been a big thing for me over my life, is learning to reclaim my voice and to speak out and to speak up. So
yeah. And then fast forward again to you're in this, boot camp style juvenile camp. Tell me about that. You called it a turning point for you.
Yes, it was. And so I remember our cadet leader, I forgot her name, I can't think of it right now, but she would come banging on the walls at 4 a.m, and we slept in these little cots and like 3 to a room, and banging on the hall saying, get up cadets, and we'd get up at 4 a.m. and start exercising in the main lobby, and then we would have to shine our boots. We wore camouflage outfits and combat boots. Wow. We had to shine our boots and put our boots on, and we would march in platoons. We'd march to breakfast. We'd have our breakfast, and then we'd march back, and we'd have school. We had school throughout the day, and it actually was a pretty, I guess, good program. I heard other bad stories from other people. I luckily had a pretty good and safe, low-key time while I was there, and the idea is to just stay low-key and quiet and keep to yourself so that you can get out, because you could get weeks added on if you got in trouble. So it's like, oh, I don't have any problem keeping to myself and being quiet, so I'm just going to keep doing this.
What was it? Was this experience scary
for you?
Oh, it was
very scary. Yeah. Oh, it was very, very scary. Yes, it was very scary, being away from home and my mom. Even though my mom and I had a strained relationship and weren't very close, it was still the unknown, and at home, at least I knew my mom and my family and was more comfortable there. It was very scary. So I miraculously found my first self-help book that I fell in love with, and it was called You Can't Afford the Luxury of a Negative Thought, and it was utterly life-changing for me. And I remember lying in bed reading this, having these aha moments and crying as this 17-year-old, thinking, oh my God, like there's another way. I can change this. I can shift this just by shifting my thoughts, shifting my thinking, my mindset, and paying attention to what I'm thinking, which was all of this negative. I'm not worthy. I'm not good enough. I hate myself. I hate the world. I hate life. To, I can do this. I can overcome this. I can move forward. I can keep going. Maybe I couldn't at that time believe I am wonderful. I am amazing. But I could believe that, I can overcome this. I can move forward.
Were you then aware of the fact that that's how you had been talking to yourself for so many years?
I was not at all aware of it until that moment. And that's why it was such a huge light bulb moment for me to realize that all of these thoughts and feelings that I was feeling were coming from my own inner voice and my own inner interpretations of how I had interpreted everything that had happened to me in my life and all of the hardships and challenges that I had been through, unfortunately, which weren't my fault. But I internalized all of these feelings of, well, that makes me not worthy. I'm not good enough. I can't do anything. I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I'll never be anyone. I have no voice. And I started realizing that that's what I was thinking and that's what I was saying to myself and that I could shift it.
Yeah. Coming to a realization like that, I'm sure it was both enlightening and kind of like, oh my God, where am I?
Extremely enlightening, extremely powerful, confusing, and that book talked about so many things like shame and guilt and inner child stuff. And it was the start of my healing journey. Mm-hmm. And it propelled me onto this amazing journey that still continues today of just constantly looking inside and looking at what can I do to improve myself in this situation, or what do I need to do to move forward and not be a victim and stuck in the victim mindset.
So then you had a shift in your life in that moment and reading that book. Tell me about that.
Very much so. So after I got out of training school, I signed up for my, it was too late to, at that time, technically go back to high school. So I signed up for my GED. I got my GED, and then I said, okay, I'm going to enroll in community college. I'm just going to start somewhere. So I enrolled in local community college and started taking classes towards computer programming and really loved that and did really well in that. I got a job working at at that time, I'm not sure where I started working at that time, but eventually got a job at a retail store locally, and which is very good for shy people because you learn how to not be working in retail. So that was very good for me because I hated it at first and I didn't want to talk to people. But it was eventually I realized, I do like talking to people and working with people. And it was very good to help me bring me out of my shell. I eventually got an associate's degree in computer programming. But then I realized, because initially I went into computer programming thinking I don't want to work with people because I don't like talking to people. So eventually I realized I do like talking to people and I want to work with people. So then I went back later for my nursing degree and got an associate's degree in nursing, which was also a saving grace. It helped me realize that I can move anywhere in the world basically and get a job as a nurse, and I loved it. It was a compassion-filled, profession where I could actually help people, and I loved it. So did that. I eventually got my bachelor's in nursing and then went back for my master's degree in nursing at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., which was a huge moment also coming from a high school dropout to one of the top universities in the country. Getting a master's degree was amazing. Yeah. So honored and blessed to have done that. And then now I'm working on my PhD currently in mind-body medicine from Saybrook University. So
I just got goosebumps.
Thank you. Not thank you for the goosebumps.
Right. No. I'm immensely proud of you, and that's incredible. I think hearing the story, people hearing it, me hearing it, I keep thinking, this book did that for you? What about, I know you did a lot for yourself, but what about it really just clicked for you?
And that's the thing, is it was the start. Mm-hmm. And I don't even know how to explain it. And I think we all have moments in our life where there's like a life-changing, life-shifting event. And it may be a book, it may be a person we meet, it may be a situation we go through. I believe there's a start of a shift for a lot of people where it's just this enlightening almost moment. And often it's in a rock bottom, what we call rock bottom moment. So for me, it just happened to be this book. And from there, I read every self-help book that I could get my hands on. I mean, I read Dr. Wayne Dyer was very, very influential. I read his books. He was an amazing mentor, teacher. You know, even though I never met him, I don't believe that we have to meet necessarily in person. Our teachers are everywhere. And I read his books. I read, there was this program I remember called Attacking Anxiety and Depression by Lucinda Bassett out of Midwestern Center for Depression and Anxiety. I was like 17 or 18, and I remember seeing an infomercial on this one night, and she was talking about anxiety. And at the time, I didn't even know that necessarily what I had was called anxiety. Maybe I'd just started learning. But it's a relief to even know that there's a name for this and that it's a thing that other people experience. So I remember crying to my mom saying, can we please get this program? I need this. I need this. This was written for me. And it was like $300. And, you know, we were poor and we had nothing. I wasn't working at the time. And my mom somehow miraculously scraped up the money to get this for me, and it was also life-changing. And there was a workbook included that included writing out like our limiting beliefs. I remember writing things down in there like, I'll never have a college degree. I'll never get a good job. I'll never be able to speak and use my voice. I'll never be able to have confidence. You know, all these things. Doing this workbook, like actually doing the work and putting in the work, however you do it, is vital. So I did the work, and then I remember reading Dr. Bradshaw books, and he talks about a lot of inner child healing. There was one, Reclaiming Your Inner Child, that I remember reading when I was like 19, which was such a blessing to have found these things at such a young age, because some people go through their entire lives not doing any inner work or not realizing that they can until later. So it was an amazing thing to have found these, and it was just one thing after another, you know, and one step after another, and putting one foot in front of the other, and just keep going and looking forward, and constantly working on my mindset and shifting out of the negative victim mentality.
Now, I imagine for people who have dealt with abuse growing up, it's very difficult to do self-reflection. And tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure it's easier to cover it up with rebellion and drugs and things like that than to actually sit there and reflect.
Very much.
That's
why I think that so many people don't, because it is hard to look at ourselves in general. Especially if you have trauma on top of that, but even just as humans in general, it's hard to sometimes look at ourselves and admit things are wrong with us and that we need to make a change instead of blaming everyone else in the whole world. So it's very difficult. That's why I feel very blessed to have been able to do such a self-reflective journey so early on in life. And you know, I don't know what the difference in me or someone else doing it. I think we eventually, hopefully, always at some point find that self-reflection. But
yeah. And you've kind of turned this into a career now.
Yes.
What are you doing now?
So that's what I'm working towards. So I'm currently a family nurse practitioner and a clinical hypnotherapist. And the hypnotherapy that I practice is called heart-centered hypnotherapy, which was developed by an amazing therapist, Diane Zimmerhoff, 35 years ago, and she's been doing this with thousands of people over the years, and it's an amazing healing modality where you actually can go in and resolve trauma and shift those underlying thoughts, you know, of I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, whatever we started believing in the traumas, to finding and validating our own worth and our own worthiness, value. Anyway, so I do that with clients and patients. So I have a couple different jobs. I do a regular job as a nurse practitioner. I do my private practice where I see patients for hypnotherapy and hypnosis and meditation, those kind of holistic alternative modalities. And I am in the process of developing a podcast, talking a lot about the victim triangle and how to step out of the victim triangle and get into an empowered mode versus being in victim mode. I'm currently in the process of trying to get my book written, and of course I'm doing my PhD, and I have 2 small children, so I have to be careful that I'm not overloading, because I tend to overload and do too much sometimes.
Oh my gosh. Looking at where you are now and then comparing it to where you were then and where you could have gone if things had been different, what's that like for you to think about?
It's very, on one hand, I'm so extremely grateful to have been able to overcome all of this, and then on the other hand, I'm very sad for those who did not. The ones who aren't able to find whatever it is within to help pull them out of it and drive themselves forward, and out of the pain. Unfortunately, there's so many children who go through these kinds of things who never, ever, ever find resolution or healing or are able to overcome it. So, which is why I want to make a point to always speak out and speak up for people who aren't able to, and give inspiration and hope and light where maybe there is none. And, if I can reach one person to help them move out of that, then I've done my job. So,
well, that's exactly why I'm so glad that we had you on as a guest. And if there's anyone listening who's maybe still dealing with any kind of trauma that's still affecting them today, is there any advice you can give?
Let's see. The biggest thing is probably never, ever give up. Never lose hope. There's always hope, even in the bleakest, darkest, most unreal situations. There's always hope, and just look for the light and keep moving forward.
What if people feel like it's too late for them?
Okay, so it's never too late. That's another big message that I preach, is it's never, ever, ever too late. I have a lot of patients and clients that are in their 20s that will say, oh, it's too late now. I'm never going to be anything. I'm never going to go to college. I'm never going to get married. I'm never going to be happy. And I say, you know what? It's never too late, ever. I didn't even get my first... I didn't even get my bachelor's degree till I didn't finish my bachelor's degree till I was like 29 years old. So it's never too late, ever. And not that a bachelor's degree is the biggest goal, whatever you want to do, or it's never too late to start over, ever.
Yeah.
Ever, ever, ever.
That's awesome. If you could go back and talk to your younger self now, I know things worked out for you incredibly with all the strength that you were able to find, but if you could go back and talk to your younger, maybe teenage self, what would you say?
Oh my gosh, I would just... And there's processes that we do in this heart-centered hypnotherapy where we actually do go back and talk to our inner child and our inner teenager. And I do this process a lot, actually. And because she still comes up sometimes, and feels, hey, look at me, I'm not worthy, or, things still come up with people all the time, even if they've healed through their things. So the biggest thing is just to take her in my arms and tell her, you are so worthy and you're so loved, no matter what.
Do you have any final words for the listeners before we say goodbye?
The biggest things are, as I mentioned, never give up. There's always hope. Always look for the light. Just keep going. Your past does not matter. It doesn't define you. You get to define you.
You think that 17-year-old laying in the cot reading that book would be proud of who you are today?
Yes, definitely.
Well, I'm so proud of you, too. I feel honored to have met you, truly. Seeing how far you've come is so inspirational, and I know that your story is going to be so inspirational.
Thank you so much for having me. This was amazing being able to come here and talk about this. Thank you so much.
Keep me updated on your podcast. Yes. I'd be happy to plug at your book and everything like that.
Yes, I will. Thank you so much.
I know people are going to want to hear more from you. So
thank you so much for having me, Savannah. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for listening to Unbroken, the podcast. We'll see you next time.